Most people never notice the exact moment a crow begins paying attention to them. It happens quietly, usually early in the morning, before the neighborhood fully wakes up, when the air still carries that cold blue stillness just before sunrise. You step outside with the same half-awake routine you've repeated 1,000 times before. The back door creaks softly. Damp grass bends under your shoes. Somewhere down the street, a truck engine turns over once and fades into the distance. And for a few seconds, everything feels ordinary. Then you hear it. One single crow call. Low, measured, close enough that it pulls your eyes upward before you even realize you're looking for it. There it is, sitting on the telephone wire above your driveway, completely still. The strange part is not that the crow is there. Crows are everywhere in America. They live beside highways, parking lots, church steeples, grocery store rooftops, quiet suburban fences. Most people pass them every day without thinking twice. The strange part is the way this one is looking at you. Not startled, not cautious, just watching. The morning light catches the edges of its feathers, turning the black into something softer, almost blue around the wings. It doesn't fly away when you move. It doesn't even flinch. And after a while, you begin to notice something even stranger. The crow is there before you are. Every morning. Same wire. Same angle. Same silence. As if it already knows the exact moment your hand reaches for the door. If you're new here, subscribe before you leave, because what you're about to learn may change the way you look at the crows in your neighborhood forever. Researchers now believe crows recognize individual human faces, memorize routines, and quietly track patterns over long periods of time. But that's only the beginning. Because the unsettling part is not that the crow remembers you. It's how quickly it seems to notice when something about you changes. And this is where things started to feel difficult to explain. Some mornings the crow would simply watch from the wire. Other mornings, it moved closer. Fence post. Mailbox. The edge of the roof above the garage. Always silent. Always waiting. And eventually, you begin to feel something you can't quite put into words. Like the bird isn't just watching where you go. It's watching who you're becoming. You probably know the feeling already, even if you never said it out loud. The sense that certain mornings carry a different kind of weight before anything has even happened yet. You walk outside holding your coffee, still tired, still thinking about the long list of things waiting for you, and somehow the world already feels aware of your mood. The trees are quiet. The air feels heavier than usual. And then you notice the crow again, watching from the same place like it never really left. Most people brush moments like that aside. They tell themselves they are imagining patterns because the human brain likes meaning. But deep down, almost everyone has experienced that strange pause when an animal seems too focused on them. A deer standing motionless at the edge of the woods. A dog staring a little too long. A bird arriving at the exact moment your thoughts drift somewhere painful. And the unsettling part is not fear. It is recognition. Because something about those moments feels personal. The crow became part of the routine slowly enough that you almost missed it. First it was only mornings. Then late afternoons too, especially on the days you stayed outside longer than usual, leaning against the porch railing while the evening light faded across the yard. Some days it called once from somewhere beyond the maple trees before you even opened the door, almost like an announcement. Other days it stayed silent, perched above the street lamp at the end of the driveway while cars passed underneath in soft waves of sound. But what stayed with you was the feeling that the bird somehow noticed the difference between the days when you were only busy and the days when something inside you felt distant. And that is where things become harder to dismiss. Because once you begin noticing the pattern, you also begin noticing how long it may have already been happening before you ever looked up. The strange thing about routines is that most people believe they are invisible inside them. You wake up at the same time, leave the house the same way, pause in the driveway looking at your phone for a few extra seconds before getting into the car. You think of these as forgettable details because to you they barely register at all. But in the natural world, repetition stands out, especially to something built to survive by noticing patterns. Researchers studying crow behavior discovered something unsettling years ago. Crows do not simply recognize places. They recognize individual humans with extraordinary accuracy, storing facial details, body movement, walking pace, and daily schedules in long-term memory. Some studies suggest they remember certain people for years. But standing there in the pale morning light with that bird watching from the wire above your driveway, the science begins to feel less like information and more like explanation. Because once you understand how closely crows observe the world around them, small things begin to look different. The fact that the bird appeared before your alarm some mornings. The way it shifted locations depending on where you stood in the yard. The way it seemed to disappear entirely on the rare days your routine changed unexpectedly. It was not random movement. It was adjustment, observation, memory. And the deeper you look into crow behavior, the stranger the hidden layer becomes. Crows are known to communicate information socially. One bird notices something, and eventually others respond to it too. Which means the crow watching you from the fence post may not only recognize your routine, it may already understand the rhythm of your life in ways you never realized were visible at all. And this is where everything started to change, because after a while, it no longer felt like the crow was simply learning where you lived. It felt like it was learning who you were when nobody else was looking. By the time autumn arrived, the pattern had settled into something almost impossible not to notice. The crow was no longer reacting after you appeared. It was anticipating you. Some mornings, it landed on the telephone wire less than a minute before the back door opened, even on days when your schedule drifted by nearly half an hour. Other times it waited on the edge of the roof, feathers lifting slightly in the cold wind while the neighborhood remained completely still around it. What researchers discovered about crow intelligence begins to matter differently once you experience something like that yourself. Scientists at the University of Washington found that crows can identify specific human faces even years later, and more importantly, they adjust their behavior based on emotional associations tied to those people. Not only memory, interpretation. A crow does not simply register that you exist. It studies whether you are predictable, distracted, calm, rushed, tense. It notices posture, pace, repetition. And because crows survive through observation, they become extraordinarily sensitive to small behavioral shifts most humans overlook entirely. Which means the mornings you stood in the driveway staring into nowhere for several quiet minutes may not have looked meaningless to the bird at all. The evenings you came home later than usual. The days you walked slower. The days you never looked up once. In human life, those moments disappear into routine. But in the natural world, routine is information. And this is the part most people never fully sit with. Somewhere above your street, on power lines and bare tree branches and rooftops you stopped noticing years ago, something intelligent may already know more about the rhythm of your life than you realize. And once that thought settles into your mind, even ordinary silence begins to feel different. After enough mornings, the bird stopped feeling separate from the landscape around your house. It became part of the shape of the day itself, like the sound of sprinklers starting 2 streets over before sunrise. Like the soft rattle of dry leaves moving across the driveway in cold wind. You stopped being surprised to see it there. And somehow, that made its presence feel even stranger. The crow had favorite places now. The crooked branch above the mailbox. The fence post near the side yard where the morning light hit first. Sometimes it stood there with one foot tucked beneath its feathers, completely still except for the occasional slow turn of its head as you moved through your routine. Other times it followed from a distance, wire to rooftop, rooftop to tree branch, always keeping the same quiet space between you. Not close enough to feel tame, not far enough to feel accidental. And without realizing it, you began responding too. You started looking for the dark shape before stepping outside each morning. On rainy days, you checked the power line first. On colder mornings, you glanced toward the maple tree where the branches swayed against the gray sky. There was something oddly grounding about seeing it there. A small constant in the middle of a life that had begun feeling harder to read lately. The strange part was how quickly the absence became noticeable too. One morning the wire was empty. No black feathers shifting in the wind. No low call from the trees beyond the street. And for a brief second, before you even understood why, the yard felt wrong. Quieter than it should have been. That is when you realize attachment rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it forms slowly through repetition. Through tiny moments your mind barely registers until one day they are suddenly missing. And this is where the story begins to move beyond observation. Because what happened next felt less like coincidence and more like something trying to keep pace with the hidden parts of your life. Winter settled in slowly after that. The trees thinned. Lawns turned pale and brittle beneath the cold. Most mornings the sky stayed the color of worn steel long after sunrise, and the neighborhood moved more quietly than usual, as if everything outside was conserving energy. But the crow remained. Some days it appeared alone. Other days there were two of them now, perched farther back along the power line where the wind moved through their feathers in slow ripples. And this is where the feeling changed. Because the birds no longer seemed attached only to your routine. They seemed connected to your state of mind. On the mornings when your thoughts felt crowded and restless, the call started earlier. Sharp sounds echoing somewhere beyond the bare trees before you even reached the door. On quieter days, the crow simply watched in silence from the fence post while you stood outside, holding untouched coffee growing cold in your hands. Researchers have noticed something unusual about crows for years. They are highly responsive not only to movement patterns, but to emotional behavior. Changes in posture, speed, hesitation, tension. Animals built around survival become experts at reading instability long before humans recognize it in themselves. And maybe that is why moments with crows can feel strangely personal. Because sometimes they seem to react to what you are trying hardest not to show. The unsettling part was how specific the timing became. The bird appeared during arguments that ended with silence lingering through the house afterward. It appeared on the evenings you stayed outside too long pretending to enjoy the cold air just to avoid going back inside. It appeared the morning you finally admitted to yourself that something in your life had quietly stopped feeling right a long time ago. And that morning, before the sun fully cleared the rooftops, the crow was already there waiting on the wire like it had known before you did. There is a reason stories about crows appear in almost every culture that has ever lived beside them. Not because people believed the birds were magical in some simple fairy tale sense, but because they seemed to notice things humans could not easily explain. In parts of the American South, older generations still talk about crows gathering near homes before major life changes. In some native traditions, crows are seen as watchers standing between ordinary life and hidden truth. Even now, many people quietly describe moments when a crow appeared during periods of grief, transition, loneliness, or emotional upheaval with timing that felt too precise to ignore. Maybe there is a practical explanation for all of it. Maybe highly intelligent animals simply become experts at recognizing human emotional patterns over time. But something about these experiences lingers longer than logic alone should allow, especially once you have lived through one yourself. Because eventually the feeling changes from being watched to being understood. One morning near the end of winter, the sky hung low and gray over the neighborhood, while cold rain tapped softly against the gutters. You stood outside longer than usual, hands buried in your jacket pockets, staring at the wet pavement without really focusing on anything. The crow was there again. Closer this time. Not on the wire above the driveway, but on the fence only 15 feet away. It did not call. It did not move. Water beaded across its dark feathers while it watched you with that same calm stillness it had carried from the beginning. And for a moment, the entire yard felt suspended. The distant traffic, the dripping branches, the soft wind moving through the empty trees. Everything quiet except that strange feeling rising in your chest that the bird was not studying your schedule anymore. It was waiting for you to finally notice something about yourself you had been avoiding for a very long time. After that morning, something subtle shifted in the way you moved through the world. Not dramatically. Nothing anyone else would notice. You still woke up at the same time. Still carried your coffee onto the back porch while the neighborhood slowly came to life around you. But now your eyes lifted automatically toward the wire before you looked anywhere else. And most mornings, the crow was already there. Sometimes the sky behind it glowed pale gold through the bare branches. Other mornings everything was wrapped in fog so thick the rooftops across the street disappeared completely, leaving only the dark outline of the bird suspended in the silence like a thought waiting to surface. You stopped trying to explain the feeling after a while. The need to rationalize it faded quietly on its own. Because whatever was happening no longer felt rooted in fear or superstition. It felt strangely grounding. Like the bird had become part of a conversation you had been having with yourself for years without fully realizing it. There are moments in life when something outside you reflects back a truth you have been avoiding internally. Not through words, not through advice, just through presence, through repetition, through showing up often enough that eventually you are forced to slow down and pay attention. The crow never changed your life in any dramatic way. It never brought answers. It never solved anything. But standing there in the soft morning stillness with cold air rising from the wet pavement and distant traffic humming beyond the trees, you began noticing things about yourself more honestly than before. The exhaustion you kept dismissing, the loneliness hidden beneath routine, the quiet feeling that too much of your life had started happening on autopilot. And somehow, each time the crow appeared, it became a little harder to look away from those truths. Not because the bird caused them, but because something about being observed so carefully made it impossible to keep pretending you did not already know. Spring arrived almost without warning. One morning, the trees that had stood empty for months carried the first thin layer of green again, and the air smelled faintly of rain and damp earth instead of cold pavement. The neighborhood sounded different too. Windows open, lawnmowers somewhere in the distance, wind moving softly through leaves that had not existed a week before. And for the first time in a long while, something inside you felt quieter. Not fixed, not transformed overnight, just quieter. The kind of quiet that comes after finally admitting the truth to yourself instead of spending every day outrunning it. That morning you stepped outside expecting to see the familiar dark shape waiting above the driveway like always. But the wire was empty. No movement on the fence line. No low call from the trees beyond the houses. Nothing. You stood there longer than usual, coffee cooling slowly in your hands while sunlight spread across the wet street in thin gold reflections. And in that stillness, you realized something that stayed with you long after the bird was gone. The crow had never appeared to warn you. It had never arrived to bring some supernatural message hidden beyond human understanding. Maybe it had only been doing what crows do best. Watching, learning, noticing patterns. But somewhere between those quiet mornings and long silent evenings, the bird had become a mirror for parts of your life you had stopped looking at honestly. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the slow drifting away from yourself that happens so gradually most people do not notice until years have passed. And maybe that is why experiences like this stay with us. Because sometimes the natural world reflects truths back to us with a patience human beings rarely offer each other anymore. The crow did not reveal your secrets. It only stayed long enough for you to finally see them yourself. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If stories like this speak to something quiet inside you, subscribe before you leave, because there are still so many things happening in the world around us that most people never truly stop long enough to notice. And somewhere outside tonight, on a wire above an empty street or a branch moving softly in the dark, another crow may still be watching someone who has not realized yet that their life is trying to tell them something. Maybe it was only a bird, but it never felt like only a bird.